I can put you, Carlos, in touch with Alan on WeChat. Give me half a second. Here's WeChat. Carlos Martinez. Go away, Alan. How do I do this? Yeah, I think you two have to do it together. Anyway, okay, I'm going to start. And hopefully Alan Ding will figure out how to do that. Okay. Okay, folks, we're getting started. Hi, everyone. Hello and welcome to another webinar co-organized by the International Manifesto Group and Friends of Socialist China. The International Manifesto Group is an international socialist and anti-imperialist group supporting the emergence of a multi- and pluripolar world. Our most important activity is holding these webinars about twice a month, informing audiences around the world on key developments that are shaping the struggle for a multipolar, equal, peaceful, and sustainable world. Friends of Socialist China is a platform that supports the People's Republic of China and spreads understanding of Chinese socialism. You can check out both organizations at their websites, internationalmanifesto.org and socialistchina.org. My name is Radhika Desai. I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group, and I will be moderating this event. Our topic today is imperialism versus multipolarity, the US and China's clashing visions of the international order. We have an absolutely glittering star-studded panel to discuss the subject today. So what I want to do now is simply frame the discussion with some flatter, perhaps more basic remarks, against which the panelists' contributions may sparkle all the more brightly. I want to make three main points. First and foremost, there's a lot of excited discussion about the turbulence to which our world has been subject over the past many months of the Trump administration's military adventurism, but also really since the COVID-19 pandemic and even earlier going back to Trump's first term. Much of this discussion has been conducted in terms of the clash of great powers, another world war, the Thucydides trap, and other such terms that abstract from the social content of these conflicts. I've been arguing in a range of works, both written and spoken, that the distinctiveness of our historical conjuncture lies in the very unique directionality of the forces of chaos and turbulence, in the fact that all the turbulence, violence, uncertainty, and chaos to which the world is today subject is emanating from the North Atlantic corner of the world. In other words, from the homelands of capitalism. Only capitalism's contradictions generate the need for a subordinated periphery onto which the cost of resolving said contradictions can be inflicted. We are living in an age in which capitalism's ability to secure this subordination, deteriorating slowly since 1914, has been accelerating in the new century and now seems to have switched into an even higher gear. Secondly, the events of today are not a return to the eve of the First World War, and this is not a world war. Again, I've been arguing, and I did so most recently in an explainer on my YouTube channel, Radhika Desai, Geopolitical Economist, that we are not in a third world war. To call the current moment, the current conjuncture, a third world war is to discount the historical advance of anti-imperialist forces precisely when they are reaching a new peak. Sure, the First World War was a conflict between major powers. However, those major powers were all capitalists, and they were bound to enter into conflict with one another, given the imperatives of imperialism each faced. The historical distinctiveness of the current phase, and also the phase represented by the Cold War, is that capitalism and imperialism have declined to a point where their adversaries are not capitalist countries hell-bent on advancing their own imperialism, but socialist countries committed to rolling it back. Contrary to the fashion in parts of the left, socialist countries are not imperialist. They are not seeking to subordinate the rest of the world. They are engaged in defending themselves, in particular their sovereignty, their autonomy to run their economy in a manner of their own choosing, not subjected to neoliberal imperialist capitalism. They are engaged, they're engaged in aiding those opposing imperialism. And they are trying to stabilize international affairs, in particular trying to prevent them from reaching a stage of nuclear war. Today's violence emanates, and I should say, by the way, that while the socialist countries are trying to prevent the world from reaching the stage of nuclear war, the West is doing everything in its power to make the escalation ladder that much shorter. That is to say, make it easier for such escalation to happen. Today's violence emanates from a capitalism in its death throes. The manifold illnesses causing its death, productive decline, financialization, soaring inequality, social division, political short circuits, and many others determine the rhythm and punctuation in the process of the left inflicting aggression, violence, death, and destruction on the world, in particular on the forces that constitute the sharp edge of the resistance to imperialism. And my third and final point is that those who fail to understand the directionality of the violence and chaos and decline of capitalism and imperialism, those who like to dub what's happened simply a clash of great powers or a Thucydides trap or a new world war, have indulged in the rather fashionable criticism of the United Nations also. It is being accused of being a creature of great power politics, unable to bring peace because it compromised the principle of sovereign equality by giving unprecedented power, including veto powers, to the big five powers. While this is prima facie true, the more relevant is the reality buried under this undeniable truth. That reality is twofold. The United Nations is a creature of a moment when the sovereign equality of all countries in the world, including countries previously colonized by the European powers, had to be acknowledged. It could no longer be put off. The great advance this represented, largely thanks to the efforts of communist and nationalist forces pitted against imperialism, can never be overestimated, no matter the limitations of the ruling elites that succeeded colonial powers, no matter the relative failure of the development projects they undertook, which also had, by the way, their relative successes. Secondly, while it is true that the United Nations compromised sovereign equality by giving permanent membership and veto powers to the big five powers, what is important to remember today is that the Soviet Union and eventually the People's Republic of China had to be included among these powers. While the Soviet Union no longer exists, its anti-imperialist legacy continues to echo, and not faintly, in the foreign policy of the Russian Federation. So those are my 3 points, and only against the background of such truths can we recognize that the foreign policy and foreign policy approaches of the capitalist countries on the one hand and the larger anti-imperialist fund at the head of which China stands cannot be equated to those of big powers, but must be distinguished, indeed sharply contrasted from them. Our panel will undoubtedly add a lot more to this, so it is to them that we must now turn. So once again, let me just see if Alan Ding has managed to solve his problems. Alan, can you see if you can say something? He's not here. Okay. Here we go. Can you say something, Alan? You are still, we can't still hear you. So I'm hoping very much that you will get some assistance and resolve that problem. Otherwise, yeah, I don't know what else to do. Try and resolve that problem, actually. Yeah. Okay. So in that case, we will go to Ben Norton, who will be speaking, who is also joining us from Beijing. Ben Norton, as most of you will know, is founder and editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. By the way, each speaker will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we will have time for question and answers. So Ben, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika. I'm going to share my screen. It's always a pleasure being here. So can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So this is a topic that is very dear to my heart. I think it's extremely important. And I'm going to begin by looking at two speeches that I've mentioned a few times in these different discussions in the past, because I think they're extremely telling, especially in terms of imperialism versus multipolarity. These are two speeches back to back that were delivered this February, one by the head of US foreign policy and one by the head of Chinese foreign policy. The first was Marco Rubio, who is not only Secretary of State, but also National Security Advisor. He's only the second person in US history to simultaneously hold both positions after Henry Kissinger, which gives an idea of the kind of power that this man holds. I would argue he's the second most powerful person in the US government after Donald Trump. And this speech that he gave was essentially an ode to colonialism. I'm not exaggerating. It was one of the most explicitly pro-colonialist speeches that I've heard in decades. And Rubio condemned communism. He condemned anti-colonial uprisings as communist-led fronts or fronts for communism. And he lamented that through anti-colonial uprisings, the red hammer and sickle was draped across vast swaths of the map, even though the hammer and sickle are not red, they're actually yellow. But I mean, he's historically illiterate. This speech made it very clear that the US empire wants to revive the era of Western global dominance through force. It wants to drag the world back to the 19th century. There have been many comparisons made to the US of today to the Gilded Age of the late 19th century in terms of the levels of inequality. Elon Musk is now the world's first trillionaire. In reality, research by current economists has shown that the level of inequality in the US, wealth inequality, is even worse today than it was at the peak of the Gilded Age. But aside from that, you can also say that the US government is bringing back the foreign policy of the Gilded Age, of the 19th century, blatant colonialism. And of course, we see this in the revival of the Monroe Doctrine by the Trump administration. Now, compare that to the speech that was given at the same conference, just moments before by China's foreign minister, Wang Yi. And it is really night and day. And you can very clearly see the demonstration of the difference between imperialism and multipolarity. Wang emphasized that today we live in a multipolar world and must practice true multilateralism. He emphasized that we need greater democracy in international relations, and all countries must abide by the same set of rules, which are underpinned by the UN Charter, with its respect for non-interference in the internal affairs of states and respect for sovereignty. All countries should be equal in terms of rights, opportunities, and rules, regardless of whether or not they are small or large. Now, since then, there have been several updates. China has launched the Global Governance Initiative, along with its other several initiatives, including the Global Development Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, Global Security Initiative. There's also now a Global AI Governance Initiative, and of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. The GGI is especially important because President Xi announced it on the anniversary of the defeat of fascism in what in China is referred to as the war against Japanese fascism and the World Anti-Fascist War, and of course we know as World War II. Now, recently, this June, the Chinese government republished a white paper that is the most comprehensive outline yet of what exactly Beijing means when it talks about the Global Governance Initiative. I'm going to look at parts of this white paper in a moment, but it's important to understand the context. Why did China publish this paper now? It's quite clear. It is a response to the aggressive unilateralism of the United States. This is, of course, not entirely new. We've seen this even in Democratic administrations and especially in Republican administrations. For instance, the George W. Bush administration famously passed the Hague Invasion Act, threatening to literally invade the Hague if a U.S. official or officials from U.S. allies are prosecuted at the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court. So this extreme unilateralism is not new. The U.S. invaded Iraq in blatant violation of international law without a UN Security Council endorsement in 2003. But of course, the Trump administration has taken it to a whole new level. The Biden administration did veto numerous resolutions in the UN Security Council that called for a ceasefire in Gaza. So again, I'm not saying this is only a problem of Republicans, but Trump has blatantly attacked international law. He said, quote, "I don't need international law," end quote. He said his power is only constrained by his, quote, "own morality," end quote, to the extent he even has any. And under Trump, the U.S. has now withdrawn from 65 international organizations, basically all UN agencies except the Security Council and the General Assembly. So China's call for the Global Governance Initiative is in response to this. And essentially what China recognizes is there's a vacuum in international leadership, but China does not want to replace US hegemony with Chinese hegemony. It does not want to replace unipolarity of one power with a new power. So China's Global Governance Initiative is a call for a new kind of international relations in the multipolar era. I'm going to look at a few excerpts of this white paper that was published by the Chinese government this June. Toward the beginning, they warn about the return of the law of the jungle. And they emphasize that international relations must be based on the United Nations and the UN Charter in opposition to unilateralism and hegemonism. Now, a quick note about China's kind of internal political discourse for people who don't know. The term imperialism is kind of more associated with the Mao era, 帝国主义. So usually Chinese officials use the term hegemony or hegemonism, 霸权, which is hegemony, and 霸权主義 is hegemonism. But they translate it as hegemonism, but really it's imperialism. When Chinese officials say this, they're not using it in the same context as the Mao era because of the associations with the Cultural Revolution and everything. So basically, China is saying that unilateralism and imperialism cause grave harm, that powerful states, primarily the US, they say certain countries. When they say that, it's, of course, a reference to the United States, are bullying the small and the weak and expressing blatant double standards. So China emphasizes that the global South needs much more representation. Now, they emphasize that the international structure that exists today, which is rooted in the United Nations, was created at the end of World War II, the World Anti-Fascist War, when still much of the global South was colonized, especially most of Africa and many parts of Asia they were formally colonized. So China emphasizes that when the UN was founded, there were only 51 member states. Today, there are 193. And most countries recognize Palestine, so it's kind of de facto 194. The only reason Palestine's not a member state is because the US has vetoed the calls by the majority of members to recognize it. So the global South represents more than 60% of the world economy and this is measured at nominal GDP at interest rates, not looking at purchasing power parity, and contributes 80% of global economic growth. China complains that the monopolization of international affairs by a small number of countries is not sustainable. And there are some organizations today that represent what a new kind of South-South cooperation and multipolar order could look like. These are not panaceas. I, of course, and many others acknowledge that there are many internal contradictions in these organizations, just as there were internal contradictions in the Bandung Conference. The Shah, the Iran of the Shah, was represented at the Bandung Conference. Despite that, these platforms are important. Despite the fact that both Iran and the UAE are members of BRICS, these are important organizations. India and Pakistan are members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But these represent possibilities, opportunities for a new kind of international relations based on South-South cooperation. It's important that this document also mentions the G77 in China. And of course, the G77 is itself rooted in the anti-colonial movement of the 1970s. Now, China recognizes that there are many problems with the existing international institutions. Especially, they acknowledge that some countries have long obstructed the reform of the UN and its agencies. This is an acknowledgement of the fact that many Global South countries have demanded more representation, especially in the Security Council. China is not in any way, as Radhika mentioned in the introduction, China is not calling for replacing the UN. They're calling for democratizing the UN so it actually represents the global majority and not just the West, which disproportionately dominates it. So you look at the permanent members. Of course, they are the victors of World War II, of the World Anti-Fascist War. So you do have China and Russia, but you also have the US, France, and the UK. You know, the US, okay, they have a permanent seat and veto power. I mean, I, as an American, think they should not, but it's especially absurd to argue that France and the UK should have veto power, considering these are relatively small countries of 70 million people. Whereas a massive country like India has 1.4 billion people and does not have a permanent seat. Brazil, over 200 million, no permanent seat. Bangladesh, Pakistan. Number 4, a people-centered approach, which is really their way of saying that we must raise the living standards of the working class, policy should be made to represent working people and not the capitalist class, not large corporations and transnational, capital. And then finally, there needs to be tangible, real action. So as I move toward concluding here, I just want to briefly review some polling that's been done, because we can talk about China's vision, but increasingly it's become clear that China's vision is the vision of the global majority. It has the support of the majority of people around the world. There has been polling done by multiple firms in the US, which cannot in any way be reliably accused of being pro-China, including Gallup and Pew Research. They both found in recent polls from 2025 and 2026 that China is increasingly popular around the world, and Gallup found that China is now more popular than the US. There was another very interesting study published that was conducted this March by a group called the Alliance of Democracies, and it's called the Democracy Perception Index. I must stress, this cannot in any way be accused of being pro-China. The Alliance of Democracies was founded by Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who was the right-wing prime minister of Denmark, and then he became the Secretary General of NATO. He was the leader of NATO. He is an Atlanticist, but his organization is interesting. I mean, they're funded by the European Union. They're funded by Palantir. They're funded by the European Endowment for Democracy. They're funded by Taiwan. Despite those associations, they polled people in 83 countries and found that China is now more popular than the United States in the vast majority, in 63 of those 83 countries. That is 76 of the polled countries, which tend to be high-income or middle-income countries. There are still many low-income countries that were not surveyed where it's likely that China is more popular than the US. So you can say that, this is the global majority. And what's striking is the only countries that have a majority positive view of the US, or rather they prefer the US over China, are countries like Japan, South Korea, Ukraine, Israel, and we know about their political associations. If you look at perceptions of the US, according to this survey funded by the European Union, you can see that around the world, most countries, or the majority of people in most countries, have a negative view
you
of
should
the
wrap up
US.
soon. Yeah.
Yes, I'm almost done. Most people have a negative view of the United States. And what's striking is this is true not only of the global South, but even many parts of the global North, including ostensible US allies in Canada and in most of Europe now. The poll also asked people in 97 countries if they support the US having military bases in their countries. The majority of people in 86 said that they oppose these. Only 4 had a majority support, which are Poland, Israel, South Korea, and the other is escaping me. Oh, it's actually, sadly, I think it's Puerto Rico, which I'm glad they considered it a country. It should be a country, but it's of course a US colony. But I mean, this demonstrates how wide global opposition is to the empire, the physical empire of 800 US military bases and installations around the world. So when we're asking why we've seen this massive shift in global opinion, why China is increasingly popular, why the US is so unpopular, I mean, it's so clear. Of course, it shouldn't be new when you consider the horrific death toll of the US empire. Millions dead in the wars in Iraq and Syria and Libya and Afghanistan and Yemen. And then you go back to Vietnam, Korea. I mean, the death toll of the US empire is in the tens of millions, but especially with a cartoonish figure like Trump, who's just so blatantly an imperialist, who so blatantly threatens to destroy entire civilizations. It's so clear that Rosa Luxemburg was right when she said more than 100 years ago that it is socialism or barbarism, and it would be difficult to find a better physical manifestation of Rosa Luxemburg's warning than what we see today in the model posed by China of a new kind of socialist market economy. It's different from the Soviet model, but it is a new kind of model that has been extremely successful. And compare that to the decadent, destructive, violent, racist system in the US that is just destroying countries around the world, causing mass chaos and devastation. It's so clear that there really only are 2 roads, and humanity, the global majority, has made it clear what side it's on. I want
Thank
to
you
thank
so much,
everyone
Ben.
for joining me.
No, it's all right. Thank you. A resounding speech as usual. That's fantastic. Now we will have Professor Chang-En Fu. Professor Chang-En Fu has written his speech, which has been translated into English, and Professor Xiaoqin Ding will be delivering it. Let me say a couple of words about both of them. Professor Chang-En Fu is president of the World Association for Political Economy, which, by the way, I should say is holding its this year's annual forum here in Greenwich in London from August 5 to 7. Professor Chang is among the most distinguished academicians in China. He holds many other positions, which I won't go into, but many of you will know about him, certainly from his appearances here at IMG events. Professor Xiaoqin Ding, as far as we are talking about WAPE, he's the Secretary General of the World Association for Political Economy. He's head of the Institute for Marxism at the Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, and also, like Professor Chang, many other things. So we are very honored to have both of you here in this respect, Professor Chang through his speech and Professor Ding for delivering it. So Xiaoqin, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Radhika.
Sorry, just 1 second, Alan. Carlos, for some reason, this is telling me it's preparing live stream. I don't know why it's telling me that, but you go ahead. I've said my bit, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So this is evening here. So I don't know whether it's afternoon. Yeah, it's afternoon at London, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm very honored to be here to be on behalf of Professor Chen Fu for his talk, and because he prepared this talk, and I was told that the time changed to 2 hours later, and then Radhika told me that it's still the same time as we were told before. Anyway, he because of his health condition, so he asked me to say hello to everyone, and I will ask me to speak on his behalf. So actually, we prepared the talk together. So the topic of this our presentation is the transformation of the international order in the era of multipolarity and China's initiative. So as we know that President Trump's visit to China last month has attracted considerable international attention, regardless of how people interpret this visit. One fact is evident: the world is undergoing profound transformation. The international order that has been largely dominated by Western capitalist powers for centuries is facing structural change, while more diverse and multipolar world is gradually emerging. The central issue facing the international community today is not simply competition between China and the US. More fundamentally, it is a historical encounter between two different visions of international order. One is based on hegemony, bloc politics, and zero-sum competition. The other is based on sovereign equality, peaceful development, and mutually beneficial cooperation. So our talk has three parts. First, the US-led international order is facing growing challenges. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States has occupied a dominant position in the global political and economic system. However, the foundations of that dominance are increasingly being questioned. Politically, unilateralism and power politics have become more visible. The frequent use of unilateral sanctions and military interventions outside the framework of the United Nations has raised concerns among many countries about the fairness and the legitimacy of the existing order. Developing countries increasingly demand greater representation in international affairs and stronger protection of national sovereignty. Economically, the global balance of power has changed significantly. China has become the world's largest manufacturing country, while emerging economies continue to increase their share of global output. The BRICS countries now represent a major force in the world economy. At the same time, the US has become increasingly dependent on financial dominance and the rule-setting advantages to maintain its leading position. Trade restrictions, technology controls, and financial sanctions have become common instruments of competition, reflecting growing challenges to the traditional economic hegemony of the United States. Militarily, although the United States remains the strongest military power in the world, recent decades have demonstrated that military superiority does not automatically translate into political leadership. From Afghanistan and Iraq to various region conflicts today, military interventions have often produced instability rather than lasting solutions. Efforts to maintain global dominance through alliance systems have also contributed to geopolitical tensions. Culturally, the assumption that modernization must follow a Western path is increasingly being challenged. The experience of China, Vietnam, and many other developing countries demonstrate that there's no single model of modernization. Countries can pursue development paths that reflect their own historical conditions, cultural values, and national conditions. What we are witnessing is therefore not merely a shift in the national power, but a broader transformation of international relations, developing models, and global governance. Secondly, multipolarity is not about replacing one hegemon with another. Some observers interpret multipolarity as a process in which China replaces the United States as the world's leading power. This interpretation misunderstands the essence of multipolarity. Multipolarity does not mean establishing a new center of domination. Rather, it means promoting greater democracy in international relations. The growing support for multipolarity among countries of the global south reflects the desire for greater equality and autonomy. Across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, countries increasingly seek development rather than confrontation, cooperation rather than conflict, and the strategic independence rather than dependence on major powers. The rise of global south has become one of the most important developments in contemporary international politics. These countries are not seeking to align themselves permanently with any particular great power. Instead, they are seeking a more balanced international system that allows all nations to participate more equally in global governance. Multipolarity is therefore not opposed to international cooperation. It is opposed to monopolization of international affairs by a small number of states. It is not opposed to globalization. Rather, it seeks a more inclusive and equitable form of globalization. It is not opposed to international rules. Rather, it advocates rules that serve the common interests of the international community. In essence, multipolarity is a process of democratizing international relations and creating a more just international order. Third, China offers a vision of international order based on win-win cooperation. One important reason why China's international initiatives have gained growing support is that China has not attempted to replicate the historical path of Western great power expansion. Unlike modernization processes historically associated with colonialism and military conquest, Chinese modernization emphasizes peaceful development and shared prosperity. China has proposed the concept of building a community with a shared future for mankind. This vision recognizes that the interests and the destinies of all countries are increasingly interconnected. Peace, development, fairness, justice, democracy, and freedom are common values shared by humanity as a whole. In recent years, China has introduced a number of important international initiatives, including the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, and the Global AI Governance Initiative. These initiatives seek to provide international public goods and strengthen global cooperation. So there are 5 principles characterizing these initiatives. First, the initiatives emphasize the sovereign equality and oppose power politics. Secondly, they promote common development rather than zero-sum competition. They encourage dialogue and mutual learning among civilizations instead of civilizational confrontation. Fourth, they advocate common security and reject Cold War mentalities. Fifth, they support extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits in global governance. Of course, the transition toward a multipolar world will not be smooth or easy. Existing hegemonic structures will not disappear automatically. Competition in trade, technology, finance, and geopolitics is likely to continue. The transformation of the international order will therefore be a long-term and a complex historical process. So to conclude, the fundamental choice facing humanity today is not China or United States. Rather, it's a choice between hegemony and equality, between confrontation and cooperation, between zero-sum competition and common developments. History has repeatedly shown that international orders based on domination and exploitation cannot endure indefinitely. By contrast, an order based on equality, development, and peace is more consistent with the common interests of humanity. Multipolarity is not a strategy designed by any single country. It is an objective trend in world development. Its purpose is not to create a new hegemony, but to move beyond hegemony. Its purpose is not to create new divisions, but to expand opportunities for cooperation. Only through peaceful development, mutually beneficial cooperation, and the democratization of international relations can humanity effectively address common challenges such as armed conflict, economic inequality, climate change, and deficiency in global governance. By working together to build a more just, inclusive, and peaceful international order, we can create a better future for all. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Xiaoqin. That was really amazing. And it sort of makes me reflect that this is what Marxism sounds like, or rather, this is the message of a Marxist party in control. I think it's wonderful. Thank you so much. Only Marxism can see the way forward with the clarity that you did. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Ken Hammond. Professor Ken Hammond is Professor of History at New Mexico State University, and he's part of an organization called Pivot to Peace and many other things besides. Ken is a great master of Chinese history, so I'm sure he'll have lots of very interesting things to say. So Ken, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Radhika, and it's always a pleasure to take part in these IMG sessions, and so I'm happy to be here and see so many faces, some familiar, some new out there. Of course, the danger when you invite historians to take part in this is that we always have to push timelines back, and I will prove to be no exception to that rule. Yeah, what I want to do briefly is just sort of embed what we've heard so far from Ben and from Chang'an Fu and via Deng Xiaoqin is to sort of embed this current moment in a deeper historical sort of process or almost like a cycle. Because what's happening in the world today is a massive reconfiguration of global geopolitical relationships. And as Marxists, we interpret this, we understand this as basically the breakdown and the hopefully eventual disappearance of the imperialism that has been so dominant for such a long time. But I want to put that into a sort of historical trajectory that may make it a little more comprehensible, the process. Because the reconfiguration that's taking place today is actually bringing the world back to the kind of multicentric order, the kind of pluripolar order that was characteristic of global relationships all the way down till, let's say, the late 18th, early 19th centuries. If you looked at the planet Earth in say 1780, there was no one single dominant center. There were centers of very dynamic economic activity. China was one, India was another, other parts of East and Southeast Asia, parts of the Islamic world, parts of West Africa, of course, Northwestern Europe, and already then the very beginnings of that in some areas in the Western Hemisphere. This was a world where there were connections between all these areas. There was a world of trade and exchange and interaction, but it was a truly multicentric system. There was no dominant center. There was no hegemonic power. Okay, that changes very rapidly, as we all know, with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the capacity of at first just England, Britain, and then a small cluster of Northwest European and North American economies that established their capitalist elites established a monopoly on modern productive industrial technologies. They were able to crank out massive volumes of goods at low, very low unit costs, which undermined existing economies, existing modes of production in places like China or Bengal or eventually Tokugawa, late post-Tokugawa Japan, Meiji Japan, and elsewhere around the world. And that triggers this first era of reconfiguration, the rise of Western imperialism. There were the efforts to establish either direct colonial rule, which we saw with the British Empire, the French, the Dutch, smaller colonial efforts by different powers, eventually the United States, seizing the Philippines, Puerto Rico, establishing its sort of bogus hegemony over Cuba. That takes place because the world is reconfigured with an industrial core in the North Atlantic world, and the rest of the world becomes the source of raw materials and market outlets for manufactured goods. So economies like China or the cotton textile industry in Bengal and other parts of India get hollowed out. Very, very deliberately, very consciously by the forces of Western imperialism. And those areas become subordinated either through direct political rule, colonial power, or in the case of China or Latin America, through other mechanisms. In China, what I like to call equal opportunity imperialism, where many, many different powers join in the exploitation of China. In Latin America, largely through financial imperialism, the manipulation of investment and construction projects and things like that. So we get this era through the 19th century, the rise and the spread of Western imperialism. And by the end of the 19th century, pretty much every place that can be subjected to imperialist domination has been done. And you wind up then with these intense rivalries and conflicts between the imperialist powers. And that starts to tear things apart. We have the two world wars, et cetera, et cetera. But along the way, you get, of course, dialectically, you get the counter force, you get anti-imperialism, you get anti-colonialism, and you get, even within the core, the industrial core, you get the rise of working class movements, you get proletarian revolutionary movements. And so the 20th century then becomes an era of breakdown, of rupture, right? Where first, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet industrialization in the 1930s and beyond, starts to break that monopoly on modern productive technologies. There's all sorts of destruction, of course, in the course of the great anti-fascist war, but the Soviets try to get back on track with rebuilding after the war, and that's an era after World War II where colonialism starts to come apart. Direct political rule becomes untenable financially in terms of just the fiscal capacity of the imperialist powers. And they have to spin off, they have to let go, either directly, as in the case of India, or through wars of national liberation in many, many different parts of the world. But colonialism comes to an end. Imperialism does not come to an end. We get neo-imperialism, we get the forms of domination that have been characteristic since the end of World War II. And of course, the United States moves into the leading position, the hegemonic position, and has sustained that in a variety of ways ever since. But those post-colonial economies in places like India or South Africa or Brazil start to struggle to create their own new productive capabilities. And there's greater degrees or lesser degrees of success with that until along comes China, right? And we simply cannot dismiss what happens with China as just another example of sort of post-colonial, post-imperialist development, because China has several factors that are substantially different than in many other places. One is simply size. The size of the country, the richness of its natural endowment, the population. This puts China in a position where what goes on there is going to matter in a way that doesn't dominate, but shapes. It becomes a powerful force shaping these ongoing developments around the world. And the other, of course, is socialism. that China is a socialist country. It is a country which has, sought for 75, 76 years now its own path of socialist development, socialism with Chinese characteristics. We can talk about all that. Um, but what you have then is China, in a sense, leading the way, and China's obvious economic growth, especially in the era of reform and opening, has created, probably the largest economy in the world, and that's going to continue to evolve and develop. The goal of socialism is of course, an economy of prosperity in which those who produce value share equitably in its distribution and consumption. And that is what China is working towards. They certainly haven't fully attained that, but that is the path upon which they continue to pursue, which they continue to pursue. So the rupture of the Western monopoly on modern productive technologies is now pretty complete. It's not just that, oh, there are some other places that are also producing goods. The initiative, the leading edge, in a sense, is now outside of the old industrial core, and we see this, in China, but we see it in other places as well. Countries like Malaysia, that are very advanced in some of their technological developments. South Korea, Japan, even though they're under American hegemony, these are independent to some extent centers of development and production. And China is the big force there. And that, of course, makes China the number one target for Western imperialism, for American-dominated imperialism. And that has been, the dynamic that has operated since the establishment of the People's Republic. When the reforms came along, the use of markets to develop the economy, the productive capacity of China, I think many people in the political elites in the West convinced themselves or wanted to believe that China's economic liberalization, as they like to call it, would lead to political liberalization, as they like to call it. In other words, to overthrowing the socialist project, to overthrowing the leadership of the Communist Party, to overthrowing the class interests of the working class, and that China would become once again integrated into a global capitalist system dominated by the United States. That dream, sort of animated American policy for a while, but that comes to an end, certainly by the time of the world financial crisis in 2008, where the West mires itself in the most destructive economic fantasies, and many, millions and millions and millions of people suffer great damage, suffer economic hardship, and the billionaires go along reaping their harvest, their benefits. China weathers that storm because of its socialist system. We don't need to go into all the details of that, but China is able to come through that to preserve the interests of its working people because of its socialist infrastructure, its socialist core. And that, I think, that's kind of a light bulb moment for Western elites, especially American elites. And we get, within just a few years, we get the so-called pivot to Asia, the Obama-led reconfiguration of American foreign policy that puts China right in the crosshairs. Containment to the degree that they're capable of doing that, trying to disrupt and, if possible, roll back China's economic development, trying to isolate China economically and technologically. Obviously, that hasn't worked. The Chinese have responded to all the sanctions, all the embargoes, all the efforts to stifle their development by simply becoming more and more effective at pursuing their own course of innovation and creativity. So now we have, of course, we have Donald Trump, who is the crudest of imperialists. Yeah, got it. But not by any means doing something that other democratic imperialists have not been doing along the way. So we have this recent summit, and this is what I'll wrap up with. This is what I'll conclude with. We have this recent summit, and it was a quite fascinating moment. Trump seemed to have to acknowledge that he wasn't there to boss the Chinese around the way that the United States has been used to bossing everybody else around. And Xi Jinping, in receiving Trump, I think conducted himself and represented the Chinese people as their new confidence, their new sense that they are achieving remarkable things. not as the new hegemons, not as the new dominant power in the world, but as an example of what can be accomplished by following the socialist path. If other countries see the Chinese example and want to emulate that, China will be happy to assist them in that. Things like the Belt and Road Initiative and many other forms of economic cooperation that they've been pursuing are examples of that. But I don't think that Trump's sense of sort of pragmatism in Beijing recently marks any kind of fundamental change in American policy, any kind of fundamental change in the American goals. I think American imperialism, Western imperialism, is going to continue to try to disrupt China, to try to repress China. But I think that what's happening in the world today is a deep global reconfiguration. And American policy is simply not going to, imperialist policy is simply not going to be effective in stopping that. It's not something that tariffs or trying not to sell them certain kinds of chips. That's just not going to happen, right? And so we are moving to a new multipolar world, one in which China is going to play an important role, but not become a single dominant hegemonic center. And that's why we call it multi-centric. So I just wanted to put all of that into a longer sort of framework that we can see is really a great cycle from the multipolarity of the 18th century world and before through the brief, unfortunately, a couple centuries long, but historically brief episode of imperialist domination, and now back to an order where people around the world pursue their paths in various ways, and with China playing a very positive and constructive role, both as an example and as a provider of assistance along those trajectories. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. I think only a historian as good as you can argue convincingly that a recent event like Xi's summit with Trump, President Xi's summit with Trump, must be understood in the thousands of year-long history of China. So thank you very much. Okay, our next speaker is Jackie Luqman. Jackie Luqman will be known to many people here as a broadcaster and so on of some repute. She's also from the Black Alliance for Peace, and I know she was recently on a delegation to China organized by Friends of Socialist China. So, Jackie, please go ahead. The floor is yours. Are you here, Jackie?
Yes,
Oh,
yes. At first,
yes.
yes,
Sorry.
I apologize. At
No,
first,
no.
it wasn't allowing me to unmute, but thank you so
Okay.
much for
Great.
inviting me to participate in this panel. Indeed, I was on the delegation last year to China for the first time. I am still stunned, so I still must go back over and over again because certainly you can't see everything that you need to see in such an expansive country that has had such an incredible, remarkable transformation in such a short period of time. And it's such a big idea. The idea of China and its accomplishments are so enormous that it's difficult to sometimes talk about it without looking at it from a very big perspective. But I appreciate the framing of this discussion because I think the Xi Trump summit really does expose the true nature and the waning power of the US rules-based order. So that's what I've been thinking about in regard to this summit. And I want to focus on a couple of ideas that they talked about, that they allegedly agreed on, and the things that the United States reported happened, but what China said happened. And I think in examining that with some of these agricultural deals, we'll see how the US really does operate as a hegemon in every aspect of life around the world. So let me start by saying that it seemed really unusual to me that the President of the United States took the CEOs of the country's largest tech firms, Amazon, Tesla, Palantir, etc., to the first state visit to China in almost a decade. That was weird to me. But in that decade, as I thought about it, the anti-Chinese rhetoric from US politicians and the media and these same tech giants and their contemporaries and their underlings has flourished with claims of Chinese spying at US tech conventions to steal innovative American technological intellectual property, if that's what you want to call it, to steal Americans' personal data through shopping apps. I mean, Temu and Shein can have all of my data for all I care. But, to undermine the global supply chain by hijacking tech like semiconductors or refusing to import certain US agricultural products, we've heard all of these awful things said about China over the past decade from the US government, US media, and US corporate bosses, particularly the tech giants. And this was all this rhetoric of the U.S. government trying to convince us that China is our enemy. They're trying to spy on us or attack us with balloons. I guess that was the big controversy a few years ago. The anti-Chinese rhetoric of the past decade has just ratcheted up to a level of ridiculousness that I thought this summit and the people of the U.S. included on the delegation would presented a very interesting situation because the lies the U.S. told about China during this time, coming from a country which is, among many despicable things, is a dictatorship of finance capital and the imperialist hegemon that China has been trying to recover from in relation to its dealings with Imperial Japan and Britain and other countries that had a stake in carving up China the same way those same countries had a stake in carving up Africa. So understanding that the members of the US delegation really represented what the United States really means when it says rules-based order. It's not diplomacy, it's capitalism. That's why the corporate bosses, the capitalist dictators were on that delegation and not, the Department of, the head of a state, the head of the Commerce Department, the head of the Department of Health and that kind of thing. So that to me reflected that the US uses the idea of trade and the dollar to control markets it wants to exploit for its own profit with no regard for the effect on or benefit to the people and their labor that feed that market, with the US military as the alternative should the trade deal not be accepted. And that's a carrot and stick proposition in which everyone knows the carrot is not good for them at all, but simply the least deadly part of the big stick of imperialist hegemony behind it all. So I think this trade and dollar hegemony aspect of the Xi-Trump summit are revealing and showing how the US focused rules-based order is already becoming less powerful in the face of China's focus on multipolarity. Because as other presenters have said, China's view of international relations largely hinges on its opposition to hegemony. Western hegemony is rooted today in US control over the dollar-centered global financial system, while China leverages its strength from its position as the world's manufacturing hub, which gives it a unique role in global supply chains. This means their competition isn't just about ideas, but it's about whether the future global order will be based on financial control and the country who has the most of it, or will it be more production oriented? Basically, will the world be profit or people focused? That's how I look at that, as simply as I can think of it. When you zoom out of that analysis a little bit, though, I think you see the difference in focus pretty starkly, or at least I do. One system uses control of the markets to dominate, control and exploit weaker nations and the people in them for the exclusive profit of the powerful nation. And if those nations don't like it, the powerful nation bombs them into submission. The other system uses the power of the people in that nation to challenge hegemonic market domination, leveraging their collective power of labor to drive innovation and advancement that benefit not just the government of the nation, but the people as a whole. This feeds into the way such a nation engages with other nations, not as weaker entities to be exploited and controlled, but equal in value to the orderly, peaceful, and mutually beneficial alliances needed to maintain a multipolar global order and, this thing called world peace. So, in essence, China's vision seeks to replace the US led dominance with a system where many have a voice, guided by the UN Charter. And I'm glad that the UN Charter was mentioned previously. The US is obviously doubling and quadrupling down on its power focused strategy to secure its interest in a world no longer dominated by one superpower. And the world doesn't want to be dominated by one superpower any longer. So we see the US continuing to do this with its recent attacks on Venezuela and Cuba, and the way in which a full occupation was threatened over and over again. But what seemed to have been done instead was very targeted threats that used US control of global financial markets to freeze those countries out and expose them to infiltration by US Western private capital interests. Previous US regimes certainly wanted a full coup with a complete change in regime to get rid of the communist menace these countries claim to represent for the US hegemony. But this regime, this Trump regime, only wants the money from the minerals, oil or oceanfront resorts. It doesn't matter what the minerals are. Forcing these countries to allow greater privatization of some public sectors is good enough for these particular capitalist dictators. China's position on all of this? China helps these nations survive under unconscionably brutal US economic pressure by sending aid we are told about, and I'm sure by negotiating when they can that we're never told about to avoid much worse outcomes for others so as not to create more global conflict. This is two completely different visions for the world and how nation states should engage with each other. In regard to just trade, that I think were exposed rather interestingly at this summit, because when talking about agricultural trade, the United States said that China agreed to purchase at least $17 billion a year of US agricultural products until 2028. It didn't mention any commitment from China to expand their markets to include more US goods. And it didn't say that the US would expand its markets to include more Chinese goods. China, on the other hand, says, yeah, they agreed to improve U.S. market access for agricultural products, but they didn't make a commitment to an amount. And it said the U.S. did agree to grant more market access to Chinese exports of dairy, aquatic products, and potted bonsai plants. I love bonsai plants, so if they're going to be less expensive, that makes me very happy. But the exports of Chinese dairy and aquatic products, that's seafood, right? That's everything that comes out of the sea. That is a game changer in regard to US manufacturers and farmers and producers of those products and Chinese manufacturers and producers of those products. And the way it was explained, the fact that this was not mentioned by Trump at all, that's typical Trumpian trickery, that he didn't tell anybody that this was a part of this deal. But it was presented to the US that China is going to pay billions to the US for US products, but China gets nothing out of the deal. Trump could not tell people he agreed to import more Chinese dairy and seafood and plants because US farmers in those industries would be undercut. Trump has already angered the US agriculture industry with the unprovoked assault on Iran, which resulted in the restriction of passage through the Strait of Hormuz, which we know has caused the rise in global prices for fuel and fertilizer. Higher fuel costs are not just a problem domestically, as we're paying more for not just gas, but everything. that relies on some type of fuel-based transportation to get it to the stores. But on an international level, the Trump regime's attack on Iran has caused the cost of moving commodities from farms to domestic processors and overseas buyers to skyrocket. And this makes U.S. products more expensive on the global markets. This is an important factor in understanding China's position on U.S. imports. China imports soybean, beef, cotton, dairy, all that kind of stuff. But U.S. tariffs made a deep impact on those products. So China and other countries went to other countries, largely South America, for less expensive products. China also turned inward and improved their own production of some products in these industries, like dairy, so that now China demands and receives a commitment from the U.S. to open its market to Chinese dairy and other agricultural products. And the U.S. agricultural industry was already hollowed out by U.S. capital trade policies and retaliatory tariffs. So China relied on its tried and true, age-old founding principle of self-sufficiency among its people and fair trade with other nations to survive U.S. tariffs and to improve relations with other countries around the world, strengthen its own economy, and yes, embarrass the United States in the process, which always makes us anti-imperialists very happy, because this does signal a great shift in the power the U.S. has in forcing other countries to do its bidding just by waving around the U.S. dollar. The idea that the U.S. is a unique nation that the rest of the countries in the world has to get all of these things from, or else you're not going to survive. And really, what the U.S. says is you either get these products from us or we will bomb you until you take them. That's not going to work any longer. As we're seeing in countries like Bolivia and even the Congo, in another trade aspect in this summit that was exposed, when the U.S. demands greater access to China's rare earth minerals and resources and such. And China's response is, well, we don't think we're restricting our rare earth minerals to anybody, but we know what you want to use them for. More war, more weapons. You don't want to use them for green energy, so we're not going to give you more access to them. When we look at the way the U.S. accesses rare earth minerals in places like Bolivia and Congo, we see that the way China responds is the reason the rest of the people in the world feel more confident to rise up and resist the U.S. going after their rare earth minerals, like in Bolivia, like in Congo. Because now these people and countries are not fighting this U.S. dollar hegemony alone. They see from the example of China, from BRICS, and the way China engages with their own countries amid their conflicts with the United States, that China is a partner that can be trusted, and they know they are not alone in this struggle. So there's so much more to learn. There's so much more to discuss. But I really do believe that paying attention to the way the U.S. and China discussed just issues of agriculture and exports and imports really show the lack of power the U.S. has and the lack of influence China has now in birthing this multipolar world that we are all fighting for. Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And I'm very sorry to have tried to limit what you had to say because it was so interesting, chiefly because I think you spoke in the best traditions of journalism, focusing on the event that occasioned this webinar, that is to say the summit between Presidents Trump and Xi, but also I think in the best traditions of a Black anti-imperialism. So thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Mick Dunford. Professor Mick Dunford is also a regular at IMG webinars. He's Professor Emeritus at Sussex University. And as some of you will know, he has lived in Beijing for many, many years. And from there from close quarters. He is a careful observer of China's economy, politics, and of course, foreign policy. Thank you, Mick. And yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Radhika.
Please make it full screen. Yeah.
I'm trying to.
Yeah.
Okay.
There.
Okay. I want to start with geography and history. 500 years ago, Europeans used Chinese inventions to put guns on ships and to start to colonize the world. Many, many years before Europeans used Chinese inventions in order to embark on the colonization of the world and to enrich themselves, Zheng He, right, the Hui Muslim mariner, set out on 7 expeditions around the fringes of the Islamic world. He carried with him on these huge ships gifts, and not one country was colonized. The reason why I make this point is that I want to emphasize that China in many ways is not just a different society, it's a different kind of civilization. And Ming Dynasty, China was also a profoundly different society from the European societies that embarked on mercantile expansion and colonialism. What the mechanisms that were set in motion ultimately led to, of course, was uneven development. And internationally, they led to invasion, domination, conflict, warfare. As powerful nation states or coalitions of states essentially sought to advance their security and their economic interests. And then after the European Enlightenment, liberal ideologies were actually instrumentalized in order to conceal or to justify interference in the affairs of other countries. Now, the second point I want to make is that in many ways, hegemony plays a vital role in maintaining the position of Western countries. So for the current extraordinarily rich Atlanticist elites, hegemony is in many ways critical because their relative prosperity is sustained by their domination of other countries and the generation of very large net inflows of resources and income from the rest of the world. So, for example, if you look at the United States, its net inflows enable it to run huge budget deficits and huge trade deficits. And its international investment position deteriorated from minus 84.6 billion in 1990 to minus 24.7 trillion right, in 2024. In that situation, there is obviously a very strong commitment to what one might call open door globalism. And the aim is, in a sense, to force open markets to the profiteering and extractive activities of the US oligarchy and of European oligarchies. Because they need collateral for existing and new debt. They need to generate streams of income, interest, dividends, rent, capital gains and profits in order to equilibrate their balance of payments and balance of trade. The United States seeks to preserve dollar seigniorage and its capacity therefore, basically to print dollars in order to purchase goods and services or to invest in other parts of the world. It seeks payment from the rest of the world for the maintenance, it calls them public goods, of US military bases. It seeks control over intellectual property rents in order to generate streams of revenue. And obviously, at present, it's seeking not just in relation to the information and communications technologies of the last industrial revolution, but to dominate the new artificial intelligence industrial revolution, in a sense, in order to preserve that position of dominance and its control of the royalties associated with the development of these activities. And it seeks markets for its military and industrial complex. And then beyond that, it basically seeks to set the rules for others and it constantly seeks leverage, military, economic, financial, and political, other kinds of leverage in order, basically, in its discussions with other countries to impose agreements that essentially serve its interests. So I think, it's important that one understands that point, in understanding why, our current world is so deeply turbulent. So, this slide, I'm sorry, is in Chinese. I should have translated it, but it derives from the occasion in 2017 when President Xi Jinping went to the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, in Switzerland, and when he announced the community of shared destiny for humankind. In his speech, he actually started by asking 5 questions. The first question was, 世界怎么了? What's wrong with our world? What's up with our world? And then he said, what are we to do about it? And then the next question he asked is, where have we come from? The 4th question, where are we now? And the 5th, where do we want to go? At that point, he then identified, on that occasion, 3, subsequently 4 deficits. The first one, Herpingschürze. The first one, a deficit of peace. Absolutely patently obvious to everyone, who lives on the surface of our planet. A deficit of development. A deficit of governance. And then, a while later, he identified a deficit of security, or a deficit of indivisible security. And it was the identification of these deficits that then led to the identification of the 4 strategies, the 4 initiatives. So, the Global Civilization Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Indivisible Security Initiative, and the Global Governance Initiative. So I think it's important to think about the way in which China arrived at these ideas, because in a sense, it's centered on a diagnosis of the problems of our world, our contemporary world. Now, I've already said, I think there are important civilization and societal differences that play a fundamental role in understanding the way in which our world has fallen, into a state of extraordinary turbulence. I've said this elsewhere, but basically one way of looking at it is to go to a series of statements that were made by Antony Blinken in 2021, 2022, when he was appointed Secretary of State. And he often repeated the following sentence. He said, the world doesn't organize itself. When we're not engaged, when we don't lead, then one of 2 things happens. Either some other country tries to take our place, but probably not in a way that advances our interests and values, or no one does, and you get chaos. When he says no one does and you get chaos, he's in a sense talking about some of the core principles of Western international relations. Whereas Chinese international relations thought is in many cases different. Historically, if you look at the past, it is simply not the case that chaos prevailed in the absence of hegemonic powers. Basically, East and Southeast Asia was at international peace for 300 years. 500 years, really, in the case of China, because China got dragged into 2 wars when Japan attacked Korea. So in that era, East and Southeast Asia were fundamentally zones of relative peace. Quite extraordinary, when you think of the turbulence and chaos that prevailed in the Western world. Basically, in that era, a polycentric Gongshang symbiosis system characterized by a set of principles, norms, and codes of conduct relating to interstate relations in which large and small countries all found a proper place over the course of millennia, fostered voluntary and tribute trade and peaceful coexistence. This concept of symbiosis, emphasizes the existence of the self in relation to others. And that's profoundly different, from this Western notion of the individual. So it's at the core of this notion that you have to find ways of coexisting, living and working in peace with others and cooperating with them. So Chinese visions, essentially, of an international order are of a harmonious order, of the avoidance of conflict through the pursuit of shared interests, mutual respect, including of civilizational differences, non-interference, and they're all rooted in Chinese concepts such as all under heaven, tianxia, relationality, guanxi, or symbiosis, gongsheng. So, we're talking about two profoundly different visions of world order. So I just want to finish by asking why, in some ways, China is a challenge to the US and to any other hegemon. China is basically a civilization state. I've already emphasized that its philosophical foundations are different. It opposes the individualistic foundations of Western liberalism, along with other civilization states, such as Iran, such as Russia, contemporary Russia. As an independent economic, technological, and military power driven primarily by planned, rational, national, political, and economic interests, as opposed to the interests of global elites. And these interests are profoundly related to improving the lives of all Chinese people. It resists the erosion of government autonomy. It resists the co-option of its elites and the tying of their interests and allegiance to the global financial architecture, rather than to sovereign national development. So China does offer an immense market, which it opens up, for foreign goods, services, and capital. But it impedes Western financial elites from accessing its resources and assets on their terms. And it avoids debt dependence. It acquires international debt. It did acquire international debt. It's now a lender, but it did in the past acquire international debt. But it also always ensured, that those resources were used in order to generate revenues that would enable them to repay that debt and restore their sovereignty. It protects its population and it protects its material resources from extreme and unsustainable exploitation. And it relates, amongst other things, to rare earth resources. And these notions are embodied in ideas of common prosperity, ecological civilization, spiritual civilization, the alternative development path, of which China has started to speak. It acts as a gravitational pull, or it's an anchor for the consolidation of states and the creation of new security, financial, and political systems. So BRI, BRICS, SCO, national currency settlement as a parallel channel, to dollar settlement, the setting of international standards. And it is also, in many ways, I would argue, a viable model for many other parts of the global South and East, insofar as they can choose a socialist path. Okay, so that is essentially what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mick. Again, such an erudite and I think important contribution, and also highlighting the importance of what it means to say that China is a civilizational state. Thank you so much. Our next contribution is from, let me get this right, from Mike Klonsky. Mike is Mike is an educator, author, and an activist based in the United States. So, Mike, please go ahead.
Hi, it's still morning for me, so I'll have to say good morning to all of you. Also wishing you a happy Father's Day. I don't know if everybody celebrates Father's Day, but fortunately I do, because I've got all my kids and grandkids on the way over here to our house in about a half an hour to come and celebrate with me. I'm still kind of pissed that we don't have Grandfather's Day, but that's a whole other story. I don't want to get into that now. I'm feeling so good this morning that I even want to wish Netanyahu and Trump happy Father's Day. Netanyahu and Trump being the sires of Satan and Beelzebub, I think they call it. I'm joking there, of course. I'm not sure what I know what Trump's genealogy is, the son of a fascist, a pro-Nazi. I'm not sure about Netanyahu, and I don't intend to get into that. My first public speech was made in 1968. I became the head of one of the heads of Students for a Democratic Society here in the United States, and I had to fly out to Oakland to give a speech before about 25,000 people in honor of Huey Newton's birthday, the leader of the Black Panther Party. And little did I know that I was seventh on the agenda behind people like Stokely Carmichael, Reyes Tijerina, Bobby Seale, some of the great orators of our generation. And by the time it came to me, I really had nothing to add. And so I just basically said, you know, what Stokely said. Thank you very much. And I got a rousing hand of applause there. I feel like that now after listening to the first group of speakers. I'm kind of hesitant to repeat some of the same things that you all have said already, and so I'll try to keep this short. There's a couple of points I just want to make. One is about imperialism. Lenin taught us that imperialism isn't a foreign policy, but rather a system built on monopoly finance capital, the export of that capital, the redivision of the world among big powers. We've already been through that this morning. Today, multipolarity doesn't mean the birth of a new world order, at least not to me. It's the breakdown of the old one as US imperialism loses the ability to dictate outcomes and socialist China rises as a counterpole outside the imperialist system, in part, also partly inside the system because it's a socialist country that still has to do trade and interaction with the rest of the world. The empire isn't collapsing. To me, it's the stage of capitalism that made empire inevitable is collapsing. Multipolarity is the system of that decay, and China's ascent is the clearest sign that the imperialist monopoly has been broken. There's a couple of things that happened this week that I think illustrate that. Well, actually, in the last couple of weeks. One, of course, is the collapse of the peace agreement that the U.S. signed with Iran. Part of that agreement, one of the 14 points that was signed onto, was that Israel would cease its bombing, its attack, its assault on Lebanon. 20 years ago, if the U.S. told Israel to do something, Israel complied because their whole existence was built upon U.S. military and financial aid. In this case, Israel, which is a country now that really depends for its survival on perpetual war, basically sabotaged the peace agreement. The point I would make here is that multipolarity also reflects the internal contradictions within the U.S. camp. It's not just a matter of the U.S. versus China, socialism versus U.S. capitalism. Both are faced with internal contradictions that help drive the events of today. The second event was that yesterday the U.S. Sued Germany. It's one of its biggest allies in Europe, because Germany was reducing the price of pharmaceuticals and selling drugs and medicines to German citizens at a highly reduced price. This meant that it put downward pressure on the price of pharmaceuticals for everyone in the world. Germany acting independently, and this infuriated Trump. The U.S. needs Germany to raise drug prices so Americans don't notice how badly they're being gouged at home. Here in this country, we have the highest prices for pharmaceuticals, medical costs. Millions of people don't have medical insurance. So when a European country like Germany lowers its costs, this means to Trump that it's going to cause problems here. Number one, it's going to reduce profits for his partners in big pharma. And number two, it's going to raise the consciousness of American working people when they see that other countries, not necessarily socialist countries, but other capitalist countries that used to be totally obedient to U.S. imperialism, are starting to act more independently, starting to recognize that the U.S. doesn't have the hold over them, isn't capable of having the hold over them that they once did, and also recognizing that there are other options available to them in terms of trade, in terms of where to buy the things they need, where to sell their products, in terms of China's Belt and Road and other independent options that are open to them. To have Iran be able to dictate the terms of a peace agreement with the most powerful country in the world is a world away from the way things were 30 years ago. The myth of American military invincibility has been shattered. It should have been shattered long ago when this invincible military was defeated in every war since World War II. But still, people were led to believe that the U.S. could defeat Iran in 3 or 4 days militarily, could wipe out their air force, could destroy their army, could take away all means of resistance. And every week or every day, really, victory was being declared by Trump and Hegseth and these people. It turned out to be quite the opposite. Every army that's defeated the U.S. Defeated it without a navy, defeated it without an air force. The Vietnamese had no air force. The Vietnamese had no navy, but they were still able to win because they took advantage of the conditions in their own environment, and they were able to mobilize the masses of people in their own country and fight a protracted war, a war of a new kind, using guerrilla tactics and things like that. The Iranians had years to prepare for this war, and despite the reactionary nature of the Iranian regime, they were still able to make use of the new kinds of warfare. They were able to figure out how a small country without a navy, without an air force, if necessary, could still control the Strait of Hormuz, for example, and control the flow of energy to at least 20% of it to the rest of the world. And so now we have a situation where the United States and the Trump regime in particular, facing the midterm elections, has to go practically plead to Iran to sign an agreement which is in tune with the conditions of that Iran dictated, not the U.S. And this is also a result of the internal conditions in the U.S. Trump's own MAGA coalition is being shattered. The 65% of American people oppose the war, including about 30% of the MAGA party itself. Faced with those conditions, Trump had to...
If you could wrap up soon, please.
Oh, okay, sure, I'm happy to.
Yeah, thanks.
Faced with those conditions, the U.S. had no choice but to do what it did. And it also had to go begging to Israel to stop its assault on Lebanon. These are all a product of what we've all termed multipolarity in the world today. New options opening up, new contradictions facing U.S. hegemonism. And as the contradiction with Germany's pharmaceuticals shows us, is that it opens up all possibilities for more possibilities for those of us doing organizing here in our own countries, basing that organizing on the concrete conditions here, not on definitions or trying to model foreign models. What's going on in the world today, especially multipolarity and the rise of China and the options that it opens, offers us a pathway to speak to American people about the kind of conditions that they're facing and how to change them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was really great. Really activist perspective, and always very much appreciated. Our next speaker will be, hang on, Jenny Clegg. Most of you, or many of you, will know Jenny Clegg from her appearance at previous IMG webinars and Friends of Socialist China activities. Jenny is an author and peacetime campaigner, the author of a very important book on China and China's foreign policy, in particular, China and the Multipolar World. So Jenny, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Radhika. Coming towards the end, following so many speakers, I will be touching on a lot of points that have been raised already, but I want to put my focus on the question of what has changed with the Xi-Trump summit. What is the critical corner that, according to the introduction to this webinar, is being turned, and what is happening with multipolarity? Past shifts in major power relations have been more dramatic. The 1963 Kennedy-Khrushchev détente veering from the brink of nuclear war towards a relationship managed by arms control. We also had the 1972 Nixon-Mao meeting, with Nixon seeking a way out of the Vietnam War, agreeing to the Shanghai One China communique. This was, of course, to lead to the normalization of US-China relations in 1979, opening a decades-long window of opportunity for China's development, pretty much up to Trump's trade war in 2017. But very little of substance seemed to come out of the Xi-Trump summit. The declaration of a constructive strategic partnership seems hopelessly overblown. Nevertheless, appearances can be deceptive. Amidst changes unseen in a century, a US now in decline and a shifting balance of power, Xi Jinping called the summit historic, and China, we must understand, takes the long view. China has not only survived the 9 years of US offensive against it, but has come out stronger. It has turned Trump's trade and tech wars around to hurt the US, and Trump's strategy to divide Russia and China will now never succeed, short of nuclear war. So Trump's national security strategy acknowledges China as a near-peer competitor. We talk a lot about US decline, but more specifically, finding itself unable to meet China's technological challenge on its own, the US has readjusted its hegemonic strategy. First, rather than asserting a unipolar control over the whole world, allies are called upon to share the burden, taking more responsibility for their own defense so as to serve as US proxies, the Europeans against Russia, Israel in the Middle East, Japan in the Asia Pacific. This means, secondly, that the US itself can focus on strategic choke points, the choke points of the Malacca Straits, the Panama Canal, and so on, as well as the choke points in supply chains, semiconductors, and also oil, whilst also the US seeks to secure its control over the Western Hemisphere. And third element here is Trump's might and right jettisoning of international laws and restraints. Now, this strategic adjustment is underpinned by the restructuring of the US economy around war, with AI and digitization at its heart, recreating its empire of dependencies through military interoperability tied up by US software. So the US remains foremost military and financial power, and its technological leadership is key. But China, on the other hand, has developed a toolkit to manage this, leveraging its huge market, now also using sanctions, as well as its control of critical minerals, which is so vital to the new US strategy and its militarized empire. Facing restrictions on semiconductors, China used its control of critical minerals to grip the US in a finger lock. Meanwhile, the war in Iran has not only exposed America's military limits, but also the limits of its financial strategy to prolong dollar hegemony by preserving the petrodollar through control of oil. And now we see the Saudis selling oil in renminbi, whilst around the world the use of renewables is speeding up to China's advantage. So in an increasingly complex world, developments have two sides. Now, Western powers, completely panicked by the uncertainty of US security guarantees and anxious to preserve their position in the top rungs of the world hierarchy, are engaging in frantic militarization, only to face being locked into US systems of interoperability. Alarmed by Trump's abandonment of international rules, but far too supine to challenge him, they nevertheless chafe against their demotion as proxies from consultative partners to servile dependence. Feeling out for foreign policy alternatives, Western leaders are seen gravitating to China, if as yet just tentatively. So as US hegemonic adjustment opens up a certain amount of strategic space, this complicates the multipolar trend, with middle powers starting to step forward to play a bigger role. On the one hand, we see their militarization and the intensification of conflicts. It seems Europe is intent on engaging Russia in a wider war. And within the differing regions around the world, powers are also jostling for position in the changing hierarchies. However, there is an underlying or secondary trend in which middle powers are also seeking greater strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy is not about breaking with the US, but rather diversifying foreign relationships in the search for a multipolar alignment as against the pressures of having to choose sides. And for regional powers, more responsible for security in their own regions amidst Trump's threats and interventions, adjusting relations with their neighbours may help propel greater regional cooperation. And we've just seen a hint of this with Turkey, Egypt, the Saudis and Pakistan stepping forward in the current crisis, so raising the prospect of common regional security architecture emerging. So turning back to China, the US can still cause a great deal of pain, But the question of who will hold the strategic advantage remains the $64 million question. From the switchback of near breakdown in relations over the last 9 years, China is looking for competition to be kept from spilling over into conflict in a more normalized risk management arrangement. Now, China doesn't trust the US one bit in looking for a deal, not least seeing how in 1982, Reagan undercut the One China Agreement by committing to sell arms to Taiwan. Like Russia and Iran, China wants a settlement that is long-lasting. A constructive partnership, strategic partnership, would surely realize a mutuality in economic relations, a peaceful coexistence with the US respecting China's red lines, and both powers working together as permanent members of the UN Security Council. But the structural contradictions here have not changed. What has changed in the contradiction is that the weaker party has grown stronger, China has strengthened, and the US cannot dictate the terms in quite the way it did before. China, in a way, has learnt to play the game better. It doesn't trust the US, but it is able to deal with it. And for now, the US is seen not so much as an active threat, but as a more manageable condition. At the summit, Xi drew the red line on Taiwan. China's absolute priority is reunification. To fully recognize China as an equal, the US has to accept that Taiwan is China's internal affair, and it has to end its power games and military support. China is not, though, actually demanding the full package. Trump's seemingly minimal gesture to pause the package in arms sales to Taiwan, falling short even of a declaration of opposition to Taiwan's independence, was in fact a significant takeaway from the summit because it's likely to impact on political dynamics in Taiwan. The leader of the opposition, Kuomintang, has just met with Xi Jinping and is talking up reopening cross-straits dialogue with an eye on leadership elections in 2028. Can Trump be kept from rocking the boat for the next 2 years? A dramatic move by China would have only riled up the US hawks. Rather, its approach is cautious indeed, advancing gradually so long as East Asian peace prevails. By drawing a red line on Taiwan, Xi Jinping also drew a line at Trump's assault on the UN, stepping right in the path of his rampage. Lest we forget, in 1945, at the founding meeting of the UN, Deng Biwu of the CPC was part of the Chinese delegation. China then gained its place as a permanent member of the UN Security Council as a united front government of a now reunified country. Now, Trump's assault on the international order is a double attack on the US-led international rules-based order as well as on the UN. Calculating that Trump's attack on the former, that is the liberal rules, may cause US allies to turn for stability to the latter, that is the UN, China directs the new international united front towards powers in the global north as well as in the global south. In the coming, let's say, 10 years, multipolarity will be shaped by 3 interconnected trends. First, the choices of middle powers between their proxy roles and their search for strategic autonomy from US influence, between their own power games and a more equitable foreign policy multi-alignment. The likelihood is that Western allies and the BRICS will veer about all over the place as they seek to secure their own positions amidst Trumpian uncertainty. Secondly, the multipolar process will develop unevenly across the regions of the global south amidst conflicts and cooperation between powers in those regions. Meanwhile, we have China looking towards its own goals of modernization in the next 10 years by 2035, and then full modernization by 2049, socialist modernization, I should say. So towards a conclusion now, a second US summit is anticipated in September. After 9 years of hostile policy, the US has gained little, and sections of the business class are realizing this. However, Trump's softening position is under attack domestically. Can the US and China keep up their positive momentum? Even a very fragile US-China détente can reduce the pressures on other states to choose sides, edging wider the space for underlying multipolar search by states for greater autonomy. Meanwhile, China looks to break America's semiconductor chokehold in 2028, well ahead of any US breakthrough in its own sourcing of critical minerals. The US has played a zero-sum game to undermine China, but is seriously struggling for a decisive victory. Meanwhile, China plays the long game of win-win. Inching forward bit by bit, dare I suggest, China will look to let the US down gently.
Thank you so much. Sorry, thank you, Jenny. That was really insightful, and I think based on your extremely multifaceted analysis of the situation between China and the US today, really appreciated. Our final speaker, I think you are our final one, Carlos. Yes, is Carlos Martinez. Carlos Martinez is co-editor of the Friends of Socialist China website, and of course also a member of the International Manifesto Group Executive Committee. So, Carlos, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Radhika. So I'm going to make Iran, rather than China or the US directly, the main focus of my remarks today, because the war there is, in my view, the sharpest illustration that we have at the moment of these two clashing visions that we've been discussing today. First, I'll talk about how the Iran war relates to the overall global struggle between imperialism and multipolarity. Second, how the emerging multipolar reality has shaped the outcomes of that war. And thirdly, how those outcomes are in turn reshaping the trajectory of the multipolar project. Why did the US and Israel launch this war in the first place? The official story we've been told, of course, is that Iran's nuclear program was causing a major threat to the world, and this is the same threadbare tale Netanyahu's been telling us since 1992. The real motivations are geopolitical, and they go to the heart of our theme today. Iran is the last major state in West Asia standing firmly as a beacon of resistance to US imperialism and Zionist expansionism. The nearby North African state of Libya was destroyed in 2011 in a NATO war of regime change. Syria was dismembered from 2011 in a proxy war waged by al-Qaeda elements facilitated, financed and armed by the West, the Israeli regime, the Gulf states and Turkey. Iran was the last domino. So its defeat, the dismantling of the Islamic Republic, and quite possibly the dismemberment of this multinational state along ethnic lines became essential to the US and Israel securing their dominance of the region. But there's an even bigger target in all of this, and that's the multipolar project in general and the People's Republic of China in particular. Iran sits at the very heart of the China-initiated Belt and Road Initiative, which is geopolitically crucial for China's access to wider West Asia, the Mediterranean and beyond, and the two countries are bound by a 25-year strategic partnership that was signed in 2021. Over the last couple of months, it's become near universally understood that whoever controls the energy flows of the Gulf, not just Iran's oil and gas, but Saudi Arabia's, Iraq's, Qatar's, the UAE's, essentially holds a knife to the throat of the world's energy markets, and above all to China, which is the world's largest oil importer. The ability to throttle that supply in the event of a hot war, for example, over China's Taiwan, is a prize Washington has long coveted. So this war was to a significant degree also a move against China, an attempt to disrupt the Belt and Road, to weaken a key BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization partner, and to seize a strategic choke point, just as the kidnapping of President Nicolas Maduro was about seizing control of Venezuela's oil flows, energy flows, in order to leverage them against Beijing. And indeed, just as the US's threats against Greenland are essentially about controlling the mineral wealth and energy flows of the North Atlantic and Arctic Ocean, or the far north, as it's increasingly known, and therefore being able to throttle them in a confrontation with China and or Russia. So I'd put it like this. This war in Iran was a last throw of the dice in terms of the project for a new American century. It's increasingly apparent that the trajectory towards a multipolar world is essentially irreversible, and the war on Iran was a desperate attempt by a declining hegemon to disrupt that trajectory while it still believes it has the military means to do so, and it backfired spectacularly on its own terms. The US burned through something like 30% of its Tomahawk cruise missiles, half of its THAAD interceptors fighting Iran. These are the very same weapons that it had stockpiled for a confrontation with China. A war that was meant to strengthen Washington's hand against Beijing has left it substantially weaker. It's left the US diplomatically isolated, regarded around the world as a rogue state. Even the Financial Times conceded that recent US actions in the Caribbean, Venezuela, and especially Iran help Beijing make the case that America is a force for global instability. So how is it that Iran in 2026 was able to survive what Mossadegh's Iran in the 1950s could not? In 1953, Britain and the US could overthrow Mossadegh's government with a handful of agents and a pile of bribes and install essentially a compliant dictatorship that was blissfully free from these crazy, unorthodox ideas about nationalizing the country's energy resources. More recently, NATO was able to destroy Libya through a combination of air power, proxy forces, and years of economic sanctions. After 13 grueling years of proxy war, Syria was subjugated. And yet in 2026, the combined military might of the United States and Israel could not break Iran. What's different? Clearly, an extremely important factor is Iran's own unity, its strategic brilliance, its level of preparedness, and its extraordinary resilience. The Iranian people have been in the streets in their millions since the 28th of February, defending their country's sovereignty, standing by their government and military, standing up for their constitution and for the gains of their revolution. And partly it's that Iran held a card no amount of firepower could neutralize: the ability to disrupt a fifth of the world's energy trade that transits the Strait of Hormuz. Arguably, this is a more effective deterrent than any nuclear weapon could be. But it's also that Iran is now woven into a changing, a more multipolar world that increasingly is willing to stand up for itself. China took a very active diplomatic role from the beginning. And you know, in the case of China, clearly the days of hide our strength and bide our time are over. China's willing to use its economic weight, its diplomatic weight to defend the multipolar project and to defend its partners in this historical transformation. China condemned the war from day one as a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter and the basic norms of international relations. It continued buying Iranian oil throughout, an economic lifeline. And when Washington sanctioned Chinese refineries for doing so, China's Ministry of Commerce ordered its companies and banks to disregard the sanctions outright on the grounds that they violate both international and domestic Chinese law. So that's the world's largest trading nation formally and openly refusing to comply with US secondary sanctions for the first time, and indeed making it illegal to do so. While it's obviously not possible for China or Russia to directly intervene militarily in Iran, and Iran itself has never suggested that such an intervention was necessary or even desired, both have provided economic support, and it's been widely reported that both countries have provided intelligence and geospatial support to the Iranian military. At the United Nations Security Council, China and Russia jointly vetoed a resolution dressed up as a shipping protection that would have legitimized the war and prepared global public opinion for an escalation and perhaps a ground invasion. Both those countries, China and Russia, had learned the lesson of 2011. Back then, they abstained on Resolution 1973, which authorized a no-fly zone over Libya on putatively humanitarian grounds. And then they watched NATO immediately kind of stretch and twist that mandate into a regime change war that ended with the destruction of the Libyan state and the murder of Muammar Gaddafi. Beijing and Moscow took that betrayal as a permanent lesson. Never again would they allow a narrow, humanitarian-sounding resolution to be turned into a license for war. Then there's Pakistan, which, drawing on its own close ties to both Tehran and Beijing, brokered the ceasefire and the memorandum of understanding that was signed last week, with China backing it every step of the way. It was the China-Pakistan 5-point peace proposal at the end of March that produced the 7th of April ceasefire. Meanwhile, there was no kind of coalition of the willing in the case of Iran. Unlike in 2003 with Iraq, Washington couldn't even assemble even its closest allies around it. Britain, the most reliable stooge when it comes to such matters, confined itself to providing base access in Diego Garcia and Cyprus, with Keir Starmer's government hedging that the war was, quote, not sufficiently anchored in international law. Even the Gulf monarchies have been playing an increasingly ambiguous game. Having watched the US defend its own unsinkable aircraft carrier, i.e. Israel, rather than them, and then seeing which way the wind was blowing, in the main, they began hedging towards accommodation with Iran. That this sort of hedging was possible at all is itself a sign of broader shifts. First and foremost, the growing economic partnership between China and the Gulf states, combined with the growing awareness that the US is no longer a reliable guarantor of their security. And what if things had worked out differently? Had the US achieved its maximal aims, the Islamic Republic of Iran would no longer exist. Reza Pahlavi would be installed as a kind of Washington subservient democratic monarch, despised as much, if not more, than his father was. Iran would leave BRICS, it would leave the SCO, it would leave the Belt and Road, it would recognize Israel, it would abandon the Palestinians. Probably, ironically, Reza Pahlavi would have US support in developing nuclear weapons, just as his father was moving towards in the 1970s. What we have instead is a very, very different outcome, and it's accelerated the multipolar trajectory rather than slowing it. First, Iran emerges strengthened and decisively oriented eastward. For decades, a debate has raged inside Iran, crudely speaking, with reformist leaning west and principlist leaning east, about the country's direction, and the war has settled that question decisively. Now, to advocate a sort of pro-US position in Iran is to isolate yourself completely from a people who've heroically defended their sovereignty in the streets for months. The clearest sign came just a few days ago. Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Bakir Kalibaf, and also now Iran's special representative for China, called Iran a full-fledged, reliable, and long-term partner of China, and said that in any bloc that emerges, there are going to be two definitive and irreplaceable countries, China and Iran. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, having met with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi in May, reported that our Chinese friends believe that Iran is different after the war and has improved its international status and proven its capability and authority, and a new era of China's cooperation with Iran and other countries is ahead. So Iran is more firmly than ever aligning itself with the multipolar and anti-imperialist forces. And incidentally, none of this betrays Khomeini's famous dictum of neither East nor West. That slogan never rejected close cooperation and strong relations with any other country. Rather, it rejected domination by any other country. Cooperation with China comes on terms of sovereignty, non-interference, and mutual respect. Secondly, the war's been a profound inspiration to empire-resistant states and movements everywhere. It's living proof that the world's foremost military power can be faced down and can be defeated. Thirdly, the outcome of the war is a serious blow to the old imperial strategy of stoking Shia-Sunni conflict. Far from lining up against Iran, four majority Sunni states, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt, convened to try to bring about an end to the war. So this long-standing and powerful weapon of divide and rule is at last being neutralized, not to mention the fact that Iran's resilience, its support for Palestine and for Lebanon, and its strikes against Israel have won it massive support throughout the Arab world. And fourthly, the war's dealt a devastating blow to the military and diplomatic reputation of the United States, which couldn't win. It saw its regional infrastructure of power projection torn to shreds. It's deepened Israel's isolation as a rogue and increasingly genocidal and fascistic state, especially with its Gaza 2.0 assault on Lebanon. Israel's more isolated than ever, and the Abraham Accords are dead. That whole project of normalizing Israel and gathering Arab states around it in order to build a sort of Middle East NATO is dead. So, to conclude, This war was supposed to arrest the journey towards a multipolar world, to take out a key BRICS partner, to sever a node of the Belt and Road, and remind the global south that resistance is futile. It's achieved the opposite. Iran's more deeply embedded at the heart of the multipolar project than ever. The Belt and Road now clearly runs not only by sea, but over land through the round-the-clock Iran-Pakistan border crossings and the Chinese-built rail from Xinjiang. The sanctions weapon has been openly defied, and the world has watched the US method of coercion fail in the face of the Chinese method of patient diplomacy oriented to peace and sovereign equality. There's a choice now in front of every country, including Britain. Cling to the coattails of a declining empire and its project for a new American century, or join the rising majority of humanity, building a world based on sovereignty, development, and peace. As a result of this criminal US-Israeli war in Iran and Lebanon, more countries are going to be drawn into the multipolar orbit, and the unipolar moment will be remembered as a brief and violent interlude in the long march of human history towards emancipation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Sorry, I had a bit of difficulty finding the right bits of the screen. Thank you. That was really amazing. A very unconventional decision you made about focusing on Iran, but of course turned out to be unerringly correct. Wonderful conclusion to our webinar. So thank you so much for that. I just want to say that, well, first of all, I want to say several things. First of all, many apologies for getting the timing wrong. I know a lot of people, including some of our regular attendees, only joined now thinking that we were starting at 4. Many apologies to you all. If it's any consolation, this has been an amazing webinar, but it has been live streamed on YouTube. And Carlos, if you could please share the YouTube link in the chat, people can watch the whole thing now. In fact, I'm sure that they will be able to watch it starting now. The second thing I wanted to say is also, yes, apologies that we will not be able to have a question and answer session. Again, I've not been too bad at chair, but I just think that since everyone took about 10 or 12 minutes and we had a lot of speakers, there was going to be relatively limited time for question and answers anyway. But in lieu of that, I would very much encourage everyone to send us in chats or by email or whatever at the IMG email contact page. Please send us any suggestions you may have of future webinars. We've already had one excellent suggestion here today to hold a webinar on China's economic system, and we certainly have plenty of expertise in this room for that. So we are definitely planning to hold one there, but you may have other equally excellent suggestions. So thank you for that. I'd also like to announce our next webinar. Our next webinar is going to mark the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. However, we have entitled our webinar, The US Revolution / Counter-Revolution at 250. Here's a brief description of the webinar, which will take place exactly 2 weeks from now on the 5th of July, so a day after the 4th of July. So I suppose we'll also be able to reflect on how the day has been marked by the Trump administration. Here's the description. 250 years after the Declaration of Independence, how should we understand 1776? The familiar story celebrates a revolution for liberty and self-government. A powerful counter-tradition argues that it was in large part a counter-revolution, a bid by slaveholders and settlers to defend slavery and westward expansion against a British Empire that had begun to constrain both. This webinar weighs the Republic's radical and democratic legitimacy, the universal language later seized on by abolitionists, suffragists, and anti-colonial movements against the realities of slavery, dispossession, and an imperial trajectory visible from the founding. We then trace that trajectory through its milestones: continental expansion, Spanish-American War of 1898, Bretton Woods settlement of 1945, and the supposedly unipolar moment of 1991, before turning to the profound crises of US state, society, and economy we are experiencing today. We ask how the US's domestic troubles connect to signs of imperial decline abroad, including military defeat in Iran, economic and technological defeat by China, and rising multipolarity, and what might come next. We have an impressive list of speakers, but that's not finalized. But we intend to invite Gerald Horn, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, Ajamu Baraka, Margaret Kimberley, Mohammed Marandi, Michael Hudson, Sarah Flounders, Alan Freeman, and Jeffrey Sachs. So I hope very much that you can all make it. We will soon have the poster ready for circulation, and hope you will help us to further circulate. Also, to remind you to please visit the IMG and Friends of Socialist China website and engage with it and support it as best you can. And for the webinar in late July, we are actually split between whether we should have a webinar on the current stage of the Iran war. As you may see, it might reignite anytime, or whether we should focus on the Ukraine conflict now that it has begun to come into focus once again. We will make the decision closer to the time, and we will inform you, of course. So I hope you will also take an interest in that. With that, I think I will bring this meeting to a close. Thank you very much for your interest. We've had a wonderful a bunch of people watching on our live stream as well. So we've had a great engagement with this webinar, and we will soon, well, the webinar is already there on the live stream on the International Manifesto Group YouTube page. So please feel free to circulate it more widely if you can. Thank you very much. Goodbye, and until the 5th of July. Yeah, goodbye. See you.